On February 19, 1942, Australia experienced the most devastating foreign attack in its history. But unlike Pearl Harbor, which everyone remembers, almost nobody remembers Darwin. In one morning, 262 Japanese aircraft dropped more bombs on an Australian town than Japan dropped on Hawaii. 250 people died. The harbor was destroyed. The town was devastated. This is the story of why nobody talks about it anymore.
To understand the bombing of Darwin, you need to understand something first. Why would Japan care about a town of 6,000 people on the northern edge of Australia? The answer lies in oil. By early 1942, Japan was at war with much of the world. They had conquered China, invaded French Indochina, crushed the British at Singapore, and now they wanted one thing more than anything else: the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch East Indies, what we now call Indonesia, had some of the richest oil reserves in the world. Java, Sumatra, Borneo. All of it was controlled by the Dutch, who had been pushed out of Europe by Hitler's Nazi Germany, so they couldn't defend their colonies. Japan saw an opportunity. If Japan could control those oil fields, they could fuel their entire war machine. They could manufacture aircraft, ships, everything. They could keep fighting indefinitely. Without that oil, their empire would starve. But there was one problem. Australia stood in the way. Darwin on Australia's northern coast was the key. It was only about 350 kilometers from where Japan was planning to invade. From Darwin, the Allies could intercept Japanese convoys heading toward Java and Timor. From Darwin, they could launch bombers that could reach Japanese positions. From Darwin, they could mount a defense. So, Japan had to eliminate Darwin as a military base. By 1942, Darwin had been transformed into a significant Allied stronghold. The population had tripled. There were 7,500 troops stationed there, Australian soldiers, American soldiers, support staff. There were air bases, naval facilities, oil storage tanks, ammunition dumps. It had become what the Allies called America's forward operating base in the Pacific. American ships were stationed there, American aircraft, American forces, and Australian forces too, all of them vulnerable to a coordinated attack. The question wasn't if Japan would attack Darwin, the question was when. And in early 1942, the Japanese military was preparing their answer. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same man who had masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor, was given a new assignment: attack Darwin, destroy the port facilities, destroy the air bases, make sure Australia cannot mount a counteroffensive against the Japanese invasion of Java and Timor. Nagumo didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what to do. He had just done it in Hawaii. He assembled the same task force that had attacked Pearl Harbor 10 weeks earlier, the aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. These were the most powerful carriers in the world. The pilots who crewed them had already proven themselves in the Pacific. And Nagumo had a plan: attack without warning, use overwhelming force, concentrate on military targets, get in, inflict massive damage, and get out before any meaningful defense could be mounted. It was the same strategy that had worked at Pearl Harbor, and Nagumo had no reason to think it wouldn't work at Darwin. What Nagumo didn't know, what nobody could have known, was that Darwin was even more vulnerable than Pearl Harbor had been. because Pearl Harbor at least had some warning systems, some anti-aircraft defenses, some fighter aircraft based there. Darwin had almost nothing.
Despite warnings that Darwin could be attacked, Australia's defenses were pathetic. Let me give you specific numbers. Darwin had exactly 16 anti-aircraft guns. The Lowe Commission, which investigated the attack afterwards, determined that Darwin would have needed 36 heavy anti-aircraft guns and 250 fighter aircraft to effectively defend itself. Darwin had 16 guns and 0 serviceable fighter aircraft. There was no radar. Radar systems existed at the time, but none had been installed in Darwin. There was no early warning system. When Japanese aircraft appeared on the horizon, Darwin's defenders had no way of knowing they were coming until they heard the aircraft engines. The few fighter aircraft that were stationed at Darwin, American P-40 Kittyhawks and Australian Wirraways, were either unserviceable or destroyed on the ground. Why were Darwin's defenses so inadequate? First, there was the budget problem. Australia in 1942 was a country at war, but it wasn't preparing for war on its own soil. The government had assumed that if war came to the Pacific, it would stay in the Pacific. It wouldn't reach Australia. This assumption was wrong. Second, there was the coordination problem. Darwin was controlled by multiple forces: Australian Army, Royal Australian Air Force, Australian Navy, and American forces. They didn't always coordinate effectively. Orders were ambiguous, responsibilities overlapped. When the attack came, nobody was entirely sure who was supposed to do what. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was the complacency. Singapore, everyone said, was the great fortress of the Pacific. Singapore would hold. The Allies would defend Malaya. The Japanese wouldn't get close to Australia. Then, on February 15, 1942, Singapore fell in just 4 days. On February 17th, Prime Minister John Curtin made a speech. He said Singapore's fall was Australia's Dunkirk. The parallel was deliberate. Just as the British had been evacuated from Dunkirk in France, the Allies were being pushed back everywhere in the Pacific. Australia was next. On February 19th, just 2 days later, Darwin was bombed. So here's the situation on the morning of February 19th, 1942. Australia's most vulnerable military installation is about to be attacked by the world's most experienced carrier task force. The defenders have no radar, no early warning, and almost no effective anti-aircraft defenses. The fighter aircraft are either broken or absent. The Americans, who were supposed to help defend Australia, were dealing with their own problems after Pearl Harbor and were stretched thin across the entire Pacific. The Australians, who controlled the territory, hadn't prepared adequately. Darwin was defenseless, and the Japanese knew it.
At 9:30 a.m. on February 19th, Darwin Radio received reports of unidentified aircraft approaching from the north. Most people thought they were American bombers. Maybe it was a training exercise. Maybe it was reinforcements arriving. At 9:58 a.m., the first bombs began to fall.
The attack came in 2 waves. The first wave consisted of 188 carrier-based Japanese aircraft. Let me describe what that looks like. Imagine the sky darkening, not from clouds, but from aircraft, hundreds of them. 0 fighters, escorting Kate Dahmers and Val dive bombers, all coming from the same 4 aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. All commanded by pilots who had already proven themselves in combat. The first targets were the ships in the harbor. Darwin Harbor was crowded that morning. There were 47 ships at anchor. American destroyers like the USS Peary, Australian warships, merchant vessels, support ships. Many of them were loaded with supplies or ammunition. Many of them had crews who had just settled in for the day. The Kate bombers came in first, dropping their loads from high altitude. The shells whistled down, and the harbor erupted in explosions. Let me name some ships so you understand the scale of destruction. The USS Peary, an American destroyer, was hit repeatedly. She went down quickly. 88 men died on that ship alone. The USAT Meigs, a transport ship, was sunk. The USS William B. Preston was damaged. But the most dramatic single event was the destruction of the motor vessel Neptuna. The Neptuna was carrying something particularly dangerous, 200 depth charges. When a bomb hit the Neptuna, those depth charges detonated. The explosion was so massive that witnesses on nearby ships said the explosion appeared to reach 100 feet into the air. The ship pointed its nose skyward and disappeared in a pall of black, oily smoke. 45 men were killed on the Neptuna, most of them crew members. After the ships, the Japanese turned their attention to the town and the military installations. On the wharfs, there were longshoremen working their morning shift. When the bombs started falling, many of them had nowhere to run. At least 21 wharf workers were killed when a heavy bomb destroyed a section of the jetty. Some of them were killed instantly. Others were buried under the rubble and died from their injuries. The worst civilian casualties occurred at the Darwin post office, which was right in the center of town. The postmaster's name was Hertel Bald. He was working with his wife Alice and their daughter Iris. They were in the main building of the post office when a bomb scored a direct hit. But that wasn't where most of the casualties occurred. Outside the post office, 6 young women telegraphists had dug a slit trench to shelter from the bombing. Their names were Emily Young, Eileen Mullen, Jean Mullen, Frida Stasinowski, Archibald Halls, and Arthur Wellington. The slit trench received a direct hit. All 6 of them were killed. They had no time to react, no time to escape, just a bomb falling out of the sky and the end of 6 young lives. At the government house, the administrator of the Northern Territory, Charles Aubrey Abbott, sheltered with his wife and staff. They survived, but not everyone was so fortunate. A young Aboriginal woman named Daisy Martin was working as a housemaid for the administrator's family. She was killed in the attack. The first raid lasted about 40 minutes. Then there was a pause. The Japanese pilots regrouped. They reloaded their weapons. They assessed the damage they had inflicted. Then, at 11:58 a.m., the second wave arrived. This time, 54 land-based bombers approached from the northeast. They were flying at 18,000 feet, too high for most of Darwin's anti-aircraft guns to reach effectively. Due to defective fuses, the few anti-aircraft guns that tried to engage them failed to hit any of the bombers. The second raid concentrated on the RAAF base at Parup, inland from the harbor. The bombers came in 2 formations, flying in perfect formation at exactly the same altitude. When they reached the target, they opened their bomb bays simultaneously and dropped their loads. The destruction was complete. Hangars were destroyed. Ammunition dumps were destroyed. Living quarters were destroyed. Aircraft on the ground were destroyed. A wing commander named Archibald Robert Tyndall was killed in this second raid. He is believed to be the first member of the Australian Air Force to die on Australian soil. By the time the second raid ended, at approximately 12:20 p.m., the Japanese had achieved their objective. They had lost only 10 aircraft. The Allies had lost 23 aircraft, 8 ships sunk, 11 ships damaged, at least 250 people dead, Between 300 and 400 people wounded, most of Darwin's military and civilian infrastructure destroyed. It was one of the most successful military raids in World War II. The Japanese had conducted a near-perfect attack against a virtually defenseless target.
In Darwin Harbor that morning was a ship called the HMAS Manunda. The Manunda was not a warship. It was a hospital ship. It was painted white, with large red crosses on its funnels and deck, clearly marking it as a medical vessel. By international law, hospital ships were supposed to be protected from attack. The Manunda had arrived in Darwin on January 14, 1942, with a full complement of medical staff, nurses, and supplies. It was expecting to receive casualties. On board were nurses from the Australian Army Nursing Service, doctors, orderlies, support staff. One of those nurses was Sister Margaret de Maistre. She was 26 years old. She had trained at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney and graduated in 1938. She had volunteered for the Australian Army Nursing Service and had already served twice in the Middle East. On the morning of February 19th, Sister de Maistre was preparing her ward on one of the decks below. She knew the bombing was coming. At 9:58 a.m., a Japanese Zero fighter plane flew in low and dropped an incendiary bomb directly into Manunda's aft hatch. The bomb came through the skylight of a room used as a music lounge on B deck and turned the room into a mass of twisted debris. Sister de Maistre, working one deck below, was killed instantly. She was hit by shrapnel that tore through her back and abdomen. She died alone in a ship full of people who wanted to save lives. She was one of the first Australian Army nurses to be killed by enemy action on Australian soil. Another nurse on the Manunda was Lieutenant Joan Somerville, a physiotherapist. She was seriously wounded when shrapnel tore through her side. Her uniform tunic still exists in a museum. You can see the original hand-sewn repair marking where the shrapnel had entered. But despite the damage, despite the fire, despite being hit and damaged and surrounded by explosions, the crew of the Manunda did something remarkable. They began rescuing people from the water. The harbor around the Manunda was a nightmare. Ships were burning. Oil was spilling from damaged vessels. The water was thick with debris. Men were struggling in the water, many of them suffering from terrible burns from burning fuel. The crew of the Manunda launched their lifeboats. They pulled people from the water. They treated the wounded as best they could despite the ongoing attack. 12 members of the Manunda's crew and hospital staff were killed that day, but dozens more were saved because of the bravery of the people on that ship. The Manunda itself survived despite the hit. Her main engines were undamaged. Her lifts between decks no longer worked, but the crew continued to function as a hospital. Surgeons worked continuously to treat the injured and dying. The wounded were carried up and down the narrow companionways. 8 days later, the Manunda, with its decks crowded with the wounded, limped into Fremantle Harbor. The Red Cross markings that were supposed to protect it from attack were still visible, but scarred by bullet holes and blast damage. The Manunda became a symbol of something important. Even in the chaos and horror of war, there were people trying to save lives.
After the bombing ended at 12:20 p.m., Darwin was not quiet, it was in chaos. In the hours after the attacks, rumors spread through the town like wildfire. The Japanese were invading, Japanese troops were landing on the beaches, the military was collapsing, the army was abandoning Darwin. Why did people believe this? Because it had happened before. Just 4 days earlier, on February 15th, Singapore, the great British fortress of the Pacific, had fallen in just 4 days. Thousands of Australian soldiers had been captured. The dominoes were falling, and Darwin was next. The panic that followed is one of the most shameful episodes in Australian military history. By late afternoon, Darwin was descending into chaos. Civilians were leaving, not calmly, not in an organized way, fleeing. The government shut down, businesses closed, civil society collapsed. What happened next was described as unseemly by the people who lived through it. The administrator, Charles Aubrey Abbott, quickly left Darwin. He was one of the first to go. He drove away in his big black Buick automobile with his wife and possessions hastily loaded into the back seat. Later, he would become known as the winner of the Adelaide River Stakes, a sardonic joke about the exodus from Darwin. For those who didn't have their own cars, there was a train heading south to Adelaide River, a small town 120 kilometers away. When it was announced that women and children would be evacuated by train, chaos erupted. Men showed up demanding to leave too. Desperate scenes, wives trying to get their husbands' seats, families separated. One journalist described it as ugly and desperate. For those who didn't get on the train, there were other options: trucks, private cars, but the roads were clogged. The red dust rose in massive clouds as hundreds of vehicles headed south along the only road out of Darwin. 9 people clung to the side of a council grader as it plowed through the red dust. They didn't care, they just wanted away from Darwin. By nightfall, approximately 50% of Darwin's civilian population was gone. But it wasn't just civilians panicking. At the RAAF base, servicemen deserted their posts in enormous numbers. Within 3 days, 278 servicemen were still unaccounted for, missing. Some were genuinely lost. Some were just gone. They had fled. But here's where it gets even darker. As Darwin emptied out, the town became a free-for-all. Looting started immediately. Soldiers and civilians broke into shops. They took whatever they could carry: cases of alcohol, tools, equipment, ammunition. There was property destruction, disorder, chaos. Drunken military personnel were firing weapons over the heads of crowds. The provost marshals, the military police, were supposed to maintain order, but they were overwhelmed. What's particularly bitter is that many historians believe some of the looters included the provost marshals themselves. Military police were accused of taking goods by the truckload. The wharves, once bustling with activity, fell silent. The dock workers fled. No one was left to unload the ships. All potential salvage operations were abandoned. Any chance of recovering surviving aircraft or equipment was gone. The military records from that day described it as complete breakdown of order and civil authority. The Adelaide River Stakes, that sardonic name for the Exodus, wasn't funny to the people who were there. It represented the moment when Australia, for the first time, had to face the reality that war was on its own soil and that people would panic. It represented the moment when the military lost control, when servicemen abandoned their posts, when soldiers participated in looting, when the most basic structures of order broke down. After 2 days of this chaos, the military finally reasserted control. They appointed officers to restore order. They arrested looters. They began to rebuild. But the damage to Australia's sense of invulnerability was permanent. Australia had been attacked on its own soil, and the response had been chaos.
Here's where the story gets complicated. For decades, it has been believed that the Australian government covered up the bombing of Darwin, that they suppressed the truth, that they hid the casualty numbers and kept it secret from the public. But historians now say that's not quite what happened. The truth is messier, and in some ways worse. On the day of the bombing, Prime Minister John Curtin did address the nation. He said, "The government regards this attack as most grave and makes it quite clear that a severe blow has been struck on Australian soil." It wasn't suppressed. It was publicly acknowledged. But the official death toll reported was 17 people. Just 17. When in reality, at least 250 had died. Why the massive discrepancy? At the time, the government was worried about morale. They were concerned that if Australians knew the true scale of the attack, that their own soil had been devastated, that they were vulnerable, that their military had failed to defend them, people would panic. They lose faith in the war effort. So they downplayed the numbers. But here's the critical thing. A Lowe commission was appointed to investigate the attacks. This was an official government inquiry led by Justice Charles J. Lowe. By March 1942, the commission had determined that approximately 240 people had died. The official count eventually became about 243 people. That number was never released to the public. Let me say that again. The government knew the true casualty count. The Lowe Commission found the true casualty count, but they didn't tell the Australian people what that count was. The Lowe Commission report wasn't released until 1945, the year the war ended, after the crisis was over, after the danger had passed. Even more troubling was the behavior of the administrator of the Northern Territory, Charles Aubrey Abbott. He sent communications claiming that Darwin was back to normal, that the city had recovered, that there was no reason for concern. It was a lie. Darwin was devastated. But here's where it gets subtle. Was this a cover-up? That word suggests a deliberate conspiracy to hide the truth. But the newspapers of the day did report that Darwin had been bombed. They did publish reports of the attack. The bombing itself was not hidden. The Australian War Memorial's historians now say, the bombing of Darwin was not suppressed. It was certainly diminished, but it was not hidden. What was hidden was the real scale of the military failure, the panic, the looting, the servicemen who fled their posts, the breakdown of order in a major Allied base. That's what the government wanted to keep quiet, because the truth was embarrassing. In 1955, the Minister for External Territories, Paul Hasluck, would call it a day of national shame. Not a day of military heroism, not a day of proud Australian resistance, but a day of national shame. The Japanese had attacked, the Australians had panicked, order had broken down, military personnel had deserted their posts, civilians had looted their own town. Admitting that would have been even worse for morale than admitting the casualty numbers. So the government engaged in what we might call strategic truth-telling. They admitted that it happened. They just didn't admit how it happened or what it meant.
Most people think the bombing of Darwin was a one-time event. It wasn't. It was the first of 64 air raids on Darwin and Northern Australia that would continue for the next 21 months until November 12, 1943. Let me describe what that meant. For nearly 2 years, the people of Darwin lived under the constant threat of air attack. Between February 1942 and November 1943, there were at least 64 separate air raids on Darwin, Katherine, Port Hedland, Broome, Townsville, and other northern Australian towns. The Broome raid on March 3, 1942, was particularly devastating. 9 Japanese Zero fighters attacked the town. Broome had become a refugee evacuation point. Flying boats from the Dutch East Indies were stopping there to refuel before continuing to Australia. When the Japanese attacked, there were 15 flying boats moored in Roebuck Bay. Many of them were filled with Dutch refugees, families fleeing the Japanese invasion of Java. The casualties included women and children. At least 88 people died at Broome, many of them Dutch civilians who'd escaped Java only to be killed in what they thought was a safe haven. A B-24 Liberator was shot down on takeoff with mostly wounded military personnel on board. More than 30 died when it crashed into the sea. But the raids continued. After Broome, after the initial shock, the raids became more routine. Smaller raids, 20 or 30 aircraft, then just bombers, then reconnaissance flights. By 1943, the Australians and Americans had better defenses, more anti-aircraft guns, more fighter aircraft. Radar systems were installed.
The Japanese started to be pushed back. But for 2 years, Northern Australia was a battlefield, and most of Australia, the southern population in Melbourne and Sydney and Adelaide, didn't really understand what was happening up there. The media didn't report on every raid. The government downplayed the campaign. The narrative became, Japan attacked once, we defended, everything is fine now. But it wasn't fine. Northern Australia remained under Japanese air threat for almost 2 years.
After World War II ended in 1945, Darwin became a ghost of itself. The military base was scaled down, the population dispersed. The town that had been a critical Allied stronghold was abandoned. But more than that, Darwin was forgotten. The bombing of Darwin was the deadliest foreign attack on Australian soil in history. It was the first time mainland Australia had been attacked by a foreign power since European settlement. It should have been seared into national memory. It wasn't. Why? Several historians have identified what they call collective shame or humiliated silence. The attack was embarrassing to Australia. The response was chaotic. Servicemen had fled their posts. Citizens had panicked. The military had failed to defend the base effectively. These aren't the stories a nation wants to tell about itself. So instead, they didn't. Darwin was sidelined in Australian history. It was overshadowed by more palatable commemorations. Anzac Day, Remembrance Day, the stories of Gallipoli. These were triumph or tragedy, but not embarrassment. Darwin was just embarrassing. Schools didn't teach much about it. Mainstream media in southern Australia didn't cover it extensively. The federal government didn't prioritize commemorations. Added to that, Darwin's population was transient. People came, people left. There was no consistent community to keep the memory alive. And in 1974, Cyclone Tracy devastated Darwin entirely. The destruction of the town in 1942 was almost literally buried under a new catastrophe 32 years later. For nearly 70 years, the bombing of Darwin was a local story, not a national one. Veterans groups tried to keep the memory alive. The Darwin Defenders, formed in 1999, pushed for recognition. But for decades, they struggled. The Australian government wasn't interested in making it a major commemoration. National media outlets weren't interested in covering it extensively. It didn't fit the narrative Australia wanted to tell about itself. But then in 2011, something changed. President Obama was visiting Australia. He came to Darwin to announce a new U.S. military presence in the region, a strategic pivot toward Asia-Pacific. And Julia Gillard, the Prime Minister, decided to make it a moment. She announced that February 19th would become Bombing of Darwin Day, a national day of observance, joining Anzac Day and Remembrance Day. Obama himself visited the USS Peary Memorial, a ship sunk in the attack, with 88 American sailors killed. Suddenly, after nearly 70 years, Darwin was back on the national radar. But here's the thing. Some historians argue that this wasn't really about historical justice. It was about politics, about maintaining the U.S. alliance, about tourism to the Northern Territory.
about commemorative ceremonies and events that could generate economic activity. The true history of Darwin, the mess, the chaos, the shame, is still not widely known. Most Australians still don't know that more bombs fell on Darwin than on Pearl Harbor. They don't know that 250 people died. They don't know about the Adelaide River stakes, or the looting, or the servicemen who fled their posts. And that's why Darwin remains a forgotten front. Not because people don't know it happened, but because people don't understand what it meant.
Return to direct address. Call to action for memory and understanding. The bombing of Darwin reminds us of something uncomfortable. History is not always neat, not always heroic. Sometimes it's messy and chaotic and reflects poorly on us. Sometimes it reveals that we panicked, that we failed, that we weren't prepared. And sometimes that's the most important history to remember. Because those failures teach us something. They teach us that we need to prepare, that we can't assume safety, that complacency is dangerous. The bombing of Darwin also teaches us that sometimes governments downplay events. Sometimes they tell strategic truths rather than whole truths. Sometimes they manage the narrative rather than just report the facts. Understanding that history teaches us to be skeptical of official narratives, to ask questions, to dig deeper. The bombing of Darwin happened 83 years ago, but the lessons it teaches are still relevant today. We're still vulnerable. We still need to be prepared. We still need to understand our history, not just the parts we're proud of, but also the parts that embarrass us. Because remembering the whole truth, even when it's uncomfortable, is how we become a more honest, more aware, more prepared society.